I would like to introduce our next speaker. We're going to be hearing from Dr. Matthew Elmore, who is the Rutgers Department of Plant Biology. Dr. Elmore is going to be speaking on the weeds of the lawn, one of my favorite topics. And I know I've gotten lots of questions at the helpline. What is this weed? Oh, great stuff. He's an assistant extensionist specialist in weed science at Rutgers University. And his research program at Rutgers focuses on weed control and turf grass with a focus on integrated strategies for weed control and cool season turf. He'll tell you what that means. Thank you, Dr. Elmore.
All right, good morning, everyone. I apologize for the state of my voice. It was fine before I went to bed last night, and then I woke up sounding like this. So my daughter, who's 4 and sounded like this last week, and I'm pretty sure it's the reason I sound like this now, told me, "Don't worry, Dad, it'll get better as the day goes on." So we'll see. I'm gonna do my best to use this microphone, and we'll get through this. So I'm going to try to go for about an hour since we're a little bit behind schedule. As I go through today, I'll pause a few times and we'll ask questions. My goal for today is to kind of go through weed management in the lawn kind of by season. So we'll kind of go through the calendar year. We'll definitely have some tangents. We'll go off on some tangents and I'll try to bring us back to the various seasons as we go through. But I'm really excited to talk to you all today because turf, especially in the home lawn, the home horticulture side, is a really big part of New Jersey, right? We just did a turf grass economic survey of the state in 2020, I believe, or 2019, right before the pandemic, but we got the results last year. And it found that turf grass covers 20% of New Jersey's land area, right? 20%. And not very much of that is golf courses. So less than 2% of that is golf courses, 2% is cemeteries, and the rest is parks, lawns, and those sorts of things. So we are, it's not a harvestable crop, but it is the biggest crop in the state. Again, as I said, we're going to go through the year in weed management, and I'll pause at various places to ask questions and get your feedback maybe on, how we can better educate the stakeholders in New Jersey. So my background, just to give you a little bit more, is I've been in turf grass my whole career. Before I started at Rutgers, I was at Texas A&M, and I would often do 8 hours on turf grass management for master gardeners. So in New Jersey, I've done, we'll do a couple hours on weeds a lot of times. So we're going to whittle it down to an hour. And my goal is to not necessarily teach you how to answer every question, but to kind of give you a philosophy on how to go about answering the questions and how to find the resources that you need to answer those questions. And also, an opportunity for you to tell me, okay, what kind of resources maybe do we need to develop or to work with your county agents and coordinators on that sort of thing? So again, that's the goal for today. All right, I gotta figure out how to. There we go. So turf grass is ideally a perennial ground cover, right? I will say, what is a cool season turf grass? That is just the type of turf grass that we grow in the northern United States. If you've ever lived in the southern United States, you're probably growing warm season turf grass there. So that would be St. Augustine grass, Bermuda grass, those sorts of things. Up here, perennial ryegrass, fescues, bluegrasses. Those are perennial cool season grasses. So they grow best in the spring and the fall. And ideally, right, turf grass is a functional landscape. Part of it is definitely aesthetic. But I think more and more we're figuring out, well, maybe there's other things that can serve the aesthetic function, but one of the things that's clear is that turf grass, from a functional perspective, particularly the perennial species that we want to grow, are very well suited for being used, right? A lawn should be walked on, a park should be used, so that the turf grasses, more so than the weeds, are, very good at holding up to traffic, surviving, from year to year, and providing both ecosystem services, so things like, temperature reductions, dust capture, preventing soil erosion. They're better at that than annual species, and they're also really good at, holding up to traffic and again, being used. So that's the goal for today. So talking about cool season turf grasses are perennials. So the question, that we're talking about weeds now, so we're going to move from turf grass and start to talk about weeds. But what is a weed? I think that's an important question that you'll want to be thinking about, because everybody has a different perspective on that. So, on the left, you have morning glory as an ornamental plant. On the right, you have morning glory. That's definitely a weed, right? So the same species is not a weed on the left and definitely a weed on the right, because it makes it very difficult to harvest corn when it's tied up with morning glory, right? So what is the definition of a weed? Well, you can get kind of academic type definitions, right? This is from the European Weed Research Society. It just says any plant or vegetation excluding fungi interfering with the growth or requirements of people. So the key word there is people. The Oxford English Dictionary basically defines the plants that we want as superior vegetation and the plants that we don't want as inferior vegetation, right? So the common theme here is that it's up to us to decide what's a weed, okay? And that's, in the eye of the beholder, basically. And I'll talk about some of the benefits of turf grass a little bit. That's not really the point of this today, but, it's going to be up to each individual person you talk to define what is a weed. I like to just say a weed is a plant out of place, right? It's a pretty easy definition. So what's the purpose of the area that you're maintaining? Is it simply aesthetics, as in the upper left-hand corner, right? Is it a lawn that maybe you walk to the mailbox or walk in from the street, a couple of times a week, right? That's a little bit different than a really high traffic area that we have on the lower left-hand corner of the screen. And I put this picture there partly because I found the description of it pretty comical. If you can see that, 7 quick solutions to keep kids trespassing off your property when you are not home. I didn't know this was a problem. But the point is, most of the turf grasses that we have that actually Rutgers is very prolific at breeding turf grasses. About half of the turf grass seed that is available for purchase was developed here at Rutgers. Turf grasses are very traffic tolerant. They're very tolerant to things like drought that we had this summer, those sorts of things, right? So very disease tolerant. The goal is to maintain a lawn that's weed free, is going to tolerate more traffic and those sorts of things. So if you go to really high traffic areas like the lawn of our country, the National Mall, they have actually in the last 5 or 10 years, I guess, done a big renovation to convert each of these panels kind of back from a weedy mess that does not tolerate traffic very well to one that does. So it's now a Kentucky bluegrass lawn, basically, whereas before it was basically a weedy mess that would basically get trampled into dirt. And with all the activity that goes on that lawn, it's important for many reasons to have, green cover there. So we're going to talk a lot about weeds today, and not to get too much into ecology and succession and that sort of thing, but most of the weeds that are problematic, especially the annual weeds, are what we kind of call early successional species. So if we go from, bare rock to a little bit of soil developed, relatively poor growing conditions, that's going to be most of our early successional species, our annuals. If we step a little bit to the right, you see grasses and perennials. That's kind of what we want in a lawn, right? A little bit of a later succession. Now, if we went to more intermediate species and the climax species, climax community for New Jersey is basically a forest, right? Our old turf grass breeder used to say a squirrel used to be able to run from Florida to Maine without touching the ground, right? Because the climax vegetation on the East Coast is trees. But that can be a little bit less functional in terms of, in these urban areas, in terms of, obviously being able to use that green space. So what we're kind of going for is to move away from those annuals a little bit more towards a hardier perennial species. And that is a big challenge in the lawn. You know, here's an example of a lawn this summer, right? So when we get a situation like this where we got a lot of drought, the perennial species, especially where the soils are poor, can suffer. And what we can end up doing if we're not managing it properly is we go back to more of this annual kind of early successional state. Because when we get these open spaces, basically disturbed areas, annual species will come in and colonize these areas, and then you'll basically be stuck in an annual weed life cycle for a while, and that's what we'll talk about today. So weeds, we're going to talk about them and classify them different ways today. Weeds are, you know, generally, I'd say kind of relentless, right? Depending on the time of year. You know, you get rid of one weed and then there's another one there to take its place. So what we want to do is move towards, you know, more of a situation where that perennial ground cover dominates. We're not talking as much about annuals, but there are perennial weeds as well. So we'll talk about annual weeds. We'll talk about perennial weeds. There are warm season weeds like crabgrass. There are cool season weeds that are germinating now, like our winter annuals and other things. Clover, right? Plants that like that spring, that fall temperature. We've got grassy weeds, sedges, broadleaf weeds, those sorts of things. So we'll kind of go through some of these classifications, and we're kind of going to do that. We're going to work through that as we go through seasons. So this is going to be probably part of our tangents today as we talk about weed ID. So again, understanding the weed is important. Why did I just talk about all those classifications? Because different weed species are controlled in different ways, which you all know, right? So we talked about the importance of weed control, and weed biology is also important, because if we can understand the biology of that weed, we can target it at the point in the life cycle where it's weakest and not try to recommend chemical control measures when they're not going to be very effective, okay? So let's start by talking about annual plants. I think a lot of you may be familiar with this classification, you know, but annual plants basically complete their life cycle within one year, not necessarily the same calendar year. So sometimes that can be as little as a growing season, but basically they germinate, they grow, they set seed, and then they're completely dead. There's nothing left. The only way that annual weed survives from one year to the next or one season to the next is the seed, okay? And we can further group these into, you know, winter annuals and summer annuals, and we'll talk about that today. But the reason annual plants can be a major problem is they grow vegetatively very rapidly. And so what you can see here is actually the remnants of a crabgrass infestation. And you can see that the darker green strips of turf and then the basically bare areas where there used to be crabgrass. So this picture was taken in November. And the reason that you see the green strips is we controlled the crabgrass in those green strips. That's how it looked in the summertime, right? So crabgrass doesn't seem like such of a problem, you know, in August, right? Maybe to some people. To some people, it's definitely an aesthetic issue. But the real problem is once it dies and completes its life cycle and it's crowded out and killed off all of our perennial vegetation, we're left with bare soil. And what you would hope in this situation is that maybe you get some winter annuals that germinate and fill the void, but you know, we'll see. So that's where we start in our calendar. We're a little bit past this right now, right? But let's start and let's start with where we are in the year. Let's start with Labor Day. So first day of school, football season, we're talking about early September here. What's going on in the landscape in early September? And that's where we'll start with winter annuals. So here's a picture that you might see in the spring, right? Does anybody know that weed? Okay, I heard it maybe. Henbit, right? So this one, henbit, my voice is, yeah. Let me get some liquid here. All right, so winter annuals, they emerge in the fall because they like it when it's cooler. So they emerge in the fall, they continue to grow in the fall, they typically flower in early to late spring, depending on the species, and then they die in the summer heat. And the key thing is they're an annual, so they completely die in that summer heat. I probably should have put this. fast the plant is growing. And then we've got our calendar year, right? We can imagine ourselves in early September and Labor Day. That's when these plants germinate in the landscape. They are growing right now. They're going to grow throughout the winter. They'll kind of pause when it gets really cold, but they don't die. And then as soon as we get to spring, they grow very rapidly. And then they set seed and they're dead at, various times by, May to June to July, depending on the plant. All right, so let's talk about that germination. All right, here's some of the winter annuals in the landscape. We don't need to learn how to identify these seedlings, but some of the ones you may be familiar with: mouse ear chickweed, purple dead nettle. We saw henbit earlier. This is what they look like right now. But we're going to go skip forward in the calendar and then we'll come back. But when you really get questions about them is in the springtime, right? Here's just a picture of spring. But when you get questions about them, probably it's in the springtime. I just use these to orient myself, to remind me where we are in the year. So this is purple dead nettle in the spring, right? This is mouse ear chickweed in the spring. This is when you're going to get the question because it's most visible. But remember, where are they in the life cycle at this point in the year? Growing rapidly in the reproductive phase, probably, especially when you get the question because they're flowering, right? When they're flowering, that's when a lot of people notice them. So that also means they're about to die. So usually the question is, oh, well, what is this? Hopefully you get a good enough picture. I do appreciate how hard it is to take a good picture. So it's a challenge. But usually the next question that I get a lot of times is, how do I kill it? Or what do I spray to kill it? And we can answer that question. We'll talk about it a little bit more later. It's kind of the boring part to me, though, what we use to spray them. The question is, why is it there in the first place? And how can you avoid continuing to have to spray for it in the future, right? And so that's where we kind of need to back up to right now, or probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, and think about, what did the lawn look like in the fall when that plant germinated? So here's a picture of a lawn from my neighborhood after this summer, right? It was a very hot and dry summer, especially where there was poor soils, or maybe the wrong turf species, or maybe no turf species. And I think a lot of these lawns were actually historically crabgrass lawns. It wasn't a great summer for crabgrass either. So we can back up. Let's think, okay, let's back up to September and think, well, what was going on there, right? So if you actually look closer at that lawn with all that bare area, what you can do if you get down right now on your hands and knees and look, and you can see all those little seedlings, all those winter annual seedlings. So the solution to this problem kind of started, a long time ago, and that needs to be part of the conversation. I think when you're talking about what do I spray, it's okay, well, here's what you can spray, but let's talk about how you cannot spray next year. So a lot of weed control and turf is really just integrated weed management. It's really just growing good perennial ground cover. Usually that's turf, but it could be other things as well. Mostly what we'll talk about and recommend from an extension perspective is going to be, how do you grow good cool season turf? But it's really just dense turf grass. And so what goes into that? It's a lot of different things that I won't cover today for the sake of time, but proper turf grass selection, right? So the right turf species in the right place should grow well without really much additional maintenance. Proper mowing, proper fertilization. It doesn't mean fertilizing 4 times a year. It just means proper fertilization, right? I fertilize my lawn once a year, maybe not even that much actually. So it just depends on the lawn, and you want to make sure you're fertilizing with nitrogen to have a relatively dense lawn, but it doesn't mean you need to fertilize as much as the companies that sell fertilizer say you need to fertilize. Irrigating, most of our perennial species, especially if tall fescue is a component of the lawn, don't need a whole lot of irrigation. But if we get extreme drought, a little bit of water can sometimes help. A big one that I think, especially after we've had a hard summer, that's important and could have helped remedy the situation we just saw, is seeding that lawn in the fall where you've got those bare areas. Because particularly with the winter annuals, now not so much with the summer annuals that we'll talk about later, but particularly the winter annuals are very weakly competitive with turf. So here's a picture actually from the research farm, and you can see these darker green plots and then the lighter green stuff around them. The lighter green stuff around them is all winter annual weeds. We didn't actually spray any herbicides here. All we did was, this was a trial where we fertilized grass a little bit more in these darker green areas, so that for other reasons. But in the case where you've got dense turf, these winter annual weeds aren't really a problem. So that's one thing to know, is particularly the winter annuals are just not that competitive where you've got a good stand of perennial cover there. So another thing to keep in mind is that whenever you get the question in late spring, those weeds are at the end of their life cycle. So while you may get questions about, well, what we want to prevent the weeds from setting seed for next year, I would say the literature out there on that suggests that what's more important is the turf cover and less important, or do we need to be concerned about setting seed? And so the thing to keep in mind is that mowing and just naturally that turf grass starting to green up in the spring is going to transition these winter annuals out relatively quickly. So there are options to spray, nothing against spraying. But it depends a little bit on the weed species, right? Especially henbit checks out very early. Some of the weeds like mouse ear chickweed though can hang on and actually be perennials in some cases. But again, most of these are going to check out pretty early. So it's something that, if the client has a question about what do I spray, it might be a chance to have this dialogue about, okay, well, let's talk about what you can spray, but here's, the pros and cons, I guess, of spraying and not spraying. Again, I want to talk a little bit about kind of non-chemical weed control, and it's all back to that picture I showed with the dense turf grass, right? Dense turf grass is really what you want to be thinking about when you're making an application of an herbicide is, okay, if I get rid of this weed, how am I then going to grow turf grass back into this stand, right? So good dense turf grass prevents weeds from establishing, but one of the things we'll talk about later is it also enhances the effectiveness of herbicide applications. So if you can couple strategies that are going to improve the density of that turf grass, like maybe it's just more nitrogen fertilizer or whatever, maybe it's seeding, that will make those herbicides work better, basically. And you can see that both when there are no herbicides applied. So here is a stand of, I believe, perennial ryegrass, where on the left, there was no nitrogen fertilizer applied. In the middle, it's hard to see this, they made 2 applications of fertilizer, and on the right, they were trying to promote a really dense stand of turf, and they made 4 applications. Without any herbicides, you can see the reductions in dandelion from the left to the right. Now, you don't need to fertilize the turf grass 4 times per year. This was an extreme example given the species and kind of the condition of the grass when they started, but it shows improving that turf density is going to reduce weeds. So other things that are important that we have fact sheets on is species selection. I mentioned this earlier, the right plant for the right place, right? Vine fescues are very shade tolerant, but maybe not a good choice for full sun. Or on the opposite, there are other species that are not going to be good in shade, and so you may have weeds in the shade that are simply just the result of the wrong turf grass plant in the wrong place. All right, so that was a bit of a tangent. So now we're back to spring, right? We're going to talk, kind of go back to our life cycle thing here, where we're going to talk about warm season annual weeds. So I'll pause right now and ask you if you have any questions on winter annuals or that kind of thing. Any questions? All right. I'm gonna get some water. Yes. Okay. Great question. If you want to fertilize once a year, the best time would be about right now. Excuse me, in the fall. Okay. And I guess a little bit more on fertilizer. I think you should definitely look this up on the fact sheets. But in general, if the lawn is, if you've lived there for a while and the lawn is perfectly dense without you having to fertilize at all, then you don't necessarily need to add more fertilizer, right? And at my house, the house has been there for 50, 60 years, I guess. I think for a good part of that, I've only been there a few years, but I think for a good part of that, they were fertilizing a lot. So turf grass is very good at bringing organic matter into the soil over a period of years. And so a lot of times, if you've got a really old property, a really old lawn, there's enough nitrogen in there that, mineralizes during the summer and becomes plant available, that it's almost a self-sustaining cycle without really a lot of need for additional nitrogen. So many of you may be lucky enough that you only have to fertilize, once a year. In a relatively new construction or a poor soil, you're going to need to fertilize more, but the best time to start is once a year. I think a general recommendation is if you can make 3 applications a year, if that's your goal, then you want to do 2 in the fall and 1 in the spring. So those fall applications are really important. So that was a great question from online. All righty, thanks. Yes. Oh. Okay, so for those of you online, Nick's laptop just died, ran out of battery, so he'll be back in a minute. It looks like everything's going okay on there. All right. So we're going to move and talk about warm season. So we're going to talk about warm season annual weeds. So we're moving from fall, we went through kind of through the winter. We could imagine ourselves going through the winter. And now we're still in spring, right? And in the case of maybe a relatively weedy lawn in springtime, it might look like this. Okay, so these are winter annual weeds. These are about to die naturally on their own. And if they're severe enough that they're actually, occupying much of the ground, then when we get to summer, this is the same picture I used before. I'm cheating a little bit, but we could be in a situation like this again, effectively, where the winter annual weeds are dying. So now what's going to come into this place? Let's say we're sitting here in May, right? We've got a lawn with relatively minimal cover. Well, we've got different weeds that are going to germinate and fill that void for the summertime. In this case, these are, when we talk about summer weeds, we're mostly concerned with summer annual grasses. So we moved from broadleafs to grasses, and we'll talk about those classifications in a little bit. But the summer annual life cycle is the opposite. They're almost complementary to one another, right? Where you get germination in the spring, mid-April, depends on the species. Some of them are earlier, some of them are later. It grows very rapidly through the summer. May, June, July, a lot of these are C4 plants. Basically, they just means their biology is such they just love it when it gets hot. 95 degrees, that's crabgrass is, perfect growing conditions. So they grow rapidly throughout the summer. Remember, they're annuals, so they're going to set seed at the end of the summer, and then right about now, at the first frost, they're completely dead, and again, reliant on that seed for next year. So real quick on classifications, because I've talked about broadleaves, I've talked about grasses, and we do kind of classify these weeds generally based on their plant family, more for the purposes of being able to control them than anything else. At least this isn't, ecologists would probably classify things a little bit differently, or not be so general maybe. But broadleaf weeds are pretty much in the landscape, just all the dicots, right? Anything that's a dicot would be, something like this, where it typically has the leaf veins are typically netted, right? You see this is a violet plant where we've got dicots. Dicots are basically just a plant whose seed leaves have 2 cotyledons. Now, you don't really see too many plants when they're at this stage, but this is why they're called dicots, right? These are the seed leaves. There's 2 leaves there. Grasses, we've kind of got them classified into dicots on the top of the screen, and then the 3 on the bottom, the 3 lines there are just different monocots. For the purposes of today, we're just going to talk mostly about grasses and then sedges, which are 2 different types of monocots. And the reason you want to be able to differentiate these is they're controlled a little bit differently. All right. Oh, signed out. Says I've been signed out. Okay. I don't know if I'm still online. It says I got signed out up here. Still good? Okay. All right, that's good. Okay, so dicots, right? Typically, this reticulate is called leaf venation, but basically the leaves and kind of this netted, the veins within the leaf kind of form this net, right? I think hopefully this is all pretty clear. Most of the plants you grow in flower beds are dicots, right? Grasses are monocots, specifically within the Poaceae family, right? Typically long, slender leaves. The leaf veins are always in parallel. So that's another way to differentiate them. You know, we're not really looking at these when they're seedlings a lot of times, but the seed leaf is one leaf instead of two, right? So within monocots, you've got grasses, sedges, and lilies. There are others, but these are probably the most common ones in the landscape. So grassy weed ID is very difficult, right? A lot of times when somebody tells me they have crabgrass, I think they're maybe just being general about what kind of, you know, oh, I got a grass that I don't like maybe. Grassy weed ID is very difficult to differentiate grasses, especially if they haven't seeded, haven't formed a seed head yet. But it is very important to be able to differentiate the grasses, especially when you're recommending control measures. So we're not going to get into being able to learn about all the different grasses today or differentiate them. There are good resources out there to do that. But the key things that, you know, hopefully you'll be able to get pictures of, but is easier said than done, are certain regions of the grass plant that can help you differentiate them from one another, right? So areas like the ligule. So if we have a grass stem in our hand and we have the leaves coming off of that stem, if you kind of pull down that leaf a little bit and look, this would be the leaf, this would be the stem. That area there in the middle, where that leaf joins the stem, is the ligule. And those ligules vary from one grass to another. You can see the one on the left is sort of hairy or fringed, it might be called. And the one on the right is what you call membranous. So it sort of looks like there's a membrane there. You know, grasses vary in terms of that. They also vary, you know, basically where you'll learn how to identify these grasses and differentiate them from one another is this sort of collar region is called. So this is what we're looking at here on the left, is the same region, different species that we're looking at in this slide, but just from a different angle. So here's an example of structures called auricles, which you can see, hopefully, these projections, they're just kind of wrapping around the stem, right? These are not necessarily common. So if you see these, it can help you narrow it down. Other identifying characteristics are things like hairs around this collar region, right? You can see hairs on the leaf margin here, very specific to this barnyard grass. Okay, so it takes a long time to learn this, and when you're learning, you don't even have to know the answer to be able to walk through a weed ID key to be able to figure this out. And there are some really good practical weed ID keys in a book that I'll talk about in a minute. But other things to help you differentiate grasses: is the stem or the bud rolled like it is on the left, or is it folded like it is on the right? So if you just pulled the stem out of the ground, rolled it between your fingers, does it roll easily, or is it flattened? Okay. So here's another example of a rolled stem, right? If you get a seed head, that really makes it a lot easier. But a lot of times these things aren't in their reproductive phase when you're getting asked the question. So we do have actually a poster on the back table that you're welcome to take, or maybe in your office, county office soon, but kind of centered around this idea that grasses are really hard to identify. So there's some pictures of these different regions that might help you if you get these types of questions. And I'll say grass identification is really important, and I appreciate everything you all are doing to provide factual information to the stakeholders, because that's why they come to master gardeners, right? It's for factual information. Sometimes I sort of get, you know, like, oh, you know, a lot of my job is not really making YouTube videos. It's providing this type of education. Then for you all, it's having these one-on-one interactions. And it's sort of like, well, how can I compete with YouTube, where somebody puts up a video and they've got 5.8 million views? You know, it's like, I got it. I unmuted. I think I'm unmuted. All right, we're good. Okay, so this is a really good guide for practical weed ID, and especially there's a nice key, like I said, for grasses that's going to ask you a lot of those questions that we talked about in terms of oracles, and it is not going to require an inflorescence for you to ID. All right, so let's keep going. Okay, well, here we're going through the calendar. We're still in April. We got a long way to go. Okay, but we're moving to a little bit of a different spot in April where we're talking about pre-emergence crabgrass control and summer annual weed control. A lot of times we use forsythia as a really key indicator for when things start. And you might have learned about this in some of your training, right? So our typical summer annual grassy weeds, we're going to get into some of the mechanics of this, are smooth crabgrass is the big one, right? Everyone's thinking about crabgrass. You look at all the marketing materials in the box stores, right? It's crabgrass. Another weed that's really newly problematic in New Jersey that used to be confined to the understory of the forest, like we've got to the left of us here outside, but seems to have jumped into turf. There's some biotypes or whatever, is Japanese stiltgrass. So that actually germinates even earlier than crabgrass, but we'll talk about some of these. And the reason these summer annuals are so competitive is that they have a life cycle that's opposite of our cool season desirable crop. So on the top of the screen, you've got the kind of the growth pattern, I guess, of a cool season grass, right? Foliar growth is very big during the spring after we come out of winter. So is root growth. As we get into the summer, you're just that those cool season grasses are just trying to survive, right? So you've hoped that everything's in a good enough state that it can survive those droughty disease conditions of the summer. And then the fall is another big period where these grasses grow very well. So quite opposite of that, you can see these warm season weeds are primed to take advantage of that weakness in the life cycle of the cool season, right? So that's why they're so problematic. So crabgrass germination typically occurs sometime after forsythia full bloom. I do think this is a really good indicator. Even when we've had weird weather years, it seems to work pretty well. So this is typically the only product that I think we should broadly recommend as a good one to be put down broad spectrum on a fertilizer product. And that is the pre-emergence that you see in the store, right? Various brands, they're all the same, relatively effective in terms of, you know, they're all similar in terms of how effective they are. But basically, it's an herbicide on a granular product often with fertilizer in there. But these are pre-emergence herbicides. They need to be applied before you see the little crabgrass seedlings that are pictured here. So that's why we use that forsythia. Typically that will full bloom, you know, a few weeks before crabgrass emerges, right? So that's a good time to put out your pre-emergence. Basically, when you do that, you're putting out those prills. You can see them here. You water them in and you sort of create this barrier in the top quarter into the soil where that herbicide resides for a period of 6 to 8 weeks until it's broken down slowly over that time by microbes, and then at that point, it's less effective. So you need to apply these things very uniformly and water them in. So some key things are they must be applied prior to weed emergence. You can see that exception there. We won't get into the details. They need to be applied, though, to established turf, and they need to be watered in, usually just with rainfall. So another key thing here is you cannot seed for 6 to 8 weeks after that application. So if you have a lawn that's in very poor condition and you want to do seeding in the springtime, which is very difficult to do, but if you want to do that, you can't do that if you're going to apply these pre-emergence herbicides. They are indiscriminate in terms of preventing seeds from developing, right? The seed will germinate and then basically it's killed. It doesn't matter if it's a tall fescue seed or a crabgrass seed, right? So you can't seed into these. They need to be applied to mature turf. They also need to be applied uniformly, right? You see this in terms of fertilizer being applied. I'll tell you the pre-emergence herbicide also doesn't move from where you put it. So it needs to be applied, you know, usually a broadcast spreader, but uniformly, right? In situations where there's a pre-emergence herbicide applied and it doesn't work, sometimes we do recommend multiple applications. You can see that in the fact sheet. More from the lawn care professional side, recommend that. If we have a failure of a pre-emergence herbicide on the home horticulture level, might want to talk more about those things to improve turf grass density. improve the ability of that turf grass to keep out the weeds, which is what we're talking about here, right? Higher mowing heights have been shown to decrease crabgrass infestations. Now, if you've got a severe crabgrass infestation the year before, mowing higher is not going to completely eliminate that, but these are things that can work to help make those herbicides work better. Other work has shown that increasing mowing height, controlling diseases in the summer, can make these pre-emergence herbicides more effective. So that's where I'd go if somebody says, well, I put out my pre-emergent and it didn't work. Well, then you can have a conversation about, did you apply it uniformly? What are some other things we can do to keep that crabgrass down? So here's just a picture of that from a turf researcher I know. But these cultural controls and trying to have good turf going into the summer are really important. We do have some fact sheets out there for more of the technical kind of details on this stuff. I want to talk a little bit about Japanese stiltgrass. You may be familiar with it in the wooded areas. Here it is, a biotype that seems to be able to survive that frequent mowing and full sun of a turf environment. All right, here's another picture of it. It looks a lot like crabgrass, but it pulls out of the ground very easily. It's really weakly rooted along these stems. And the key issue is that when we're applying our crabgrass pre-emergence, which is typically early to mid-April, here's what Japanese stiltgrass looks like. It's already germinated, right? It's already come up. And so we did a little bit of work on this, a little bit more work on this weed this year, because there's been so much interest and so many questions about it. And one of the things, this is not scientific here, but just observations this year, was it emerged in mid-March in a couple of different places in New Jersey, and by early April in some cooler regions of New Jersey. Right, so soil temperature wise, it seems like it germinates earlier than crabgrass. I don't need to get into the details too much, but we did some work this year, some research at the Snyder farm. We found that pre-emergence applied in mid-March were effective against this weed. So when we adjusted things, because we've got a new weed species, when we adjusted things, we knew we had stiltgrass. We applied those pre-emergence about a month earlier than you normally would. They were effective. So I wish I had better information, a phenological indicator or something like that. But this is a little bit, preliminary. But the point is, if you've got stiltgrass, one of the things you can talk about, and you can use this fact sheet that Pete Nietzsche put together, is that it just germinates a lot earlier. And we want to figure out a little bit, hone in on exactly when that is a little bit more. But again, it comes up fairly early. So I'm going to talk briefly about spring seedings here, because we talked about how bare soil is kind of a problem when it comes to summer annual weeds. But I will say spring seedings are extraordinarily difficult to pull off. And the main reason for that is you're competing against summer annual weeds, right? So what you do in the spring is you probably disturb the soil a little bit. You might rake it, or extreme would be tilling it up, but do something to try to get that seed in there. You kind of open up that canopy a little bit, or maybe it's already open because you're seeding because there wasn't much there before. But we're in spring, you're applying fertilizer because you're seeding, you're watering a lot because you're seeding, and there's plenty of sunlight available to those seedlings of the weed just as much as the turf grass. So, and then we're headed into a period where, say we're doing this in April or probably May, right? We're already here on that shoot growth calendar for cool season turf. We're at really the end of those good growing conditions. And then we're going to put a little baby turf seedling out there and say, go survive the summer and compete against those warm season weeds, right? Good luck. It takes a lot of herbicides to be able to do that successfully. And remember, we can't use the most effective herbicide, which is those pre-emergence. So it's very challenging. I'll kind of leave it there and just say, that's almost like a whole nother topic in itself. But I'm not against spring seedings because they are good for certain situations, but they're very, very difficult to complete successfully, even on the professional side of things. So dandelions, let's talk a little bit about broadleaf weed control because we're in spring. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. Okay, would a cold winter, or I guess the drought from the summer, change the germination cycle? No, the winter, the cold of the winter doesn't affect seed, summer annual seed germination in the springtime. It's really all about how those soils warm after the winter. So if it's very cold and that soil freezes, it takes a little bit longer to warm up, then things will germinate a little bit later. But the seed don't really care if we have a cold winter or a warm one. Good question. Hopefully that answers it. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Question is, if there's a lot of moss, what do we need to do with the moss? You do probably, you want to remove that moss to be able to get that seed to have contact with the soil. But the other question you want to ask is, why is there moss there? Moss does really well in shaded environments. They're going to be difficult to grow turf grass anyway. So you might want to think about another ground cover in that situation. Or at least if you haven't already tried, try like a fine fescue or a turf that's really tolerant to shade. Good question. Yeah, so other than pre-emergence, what options are available? We'll talk about post-emergence in a little bit, but those are less economical, more difficult to get to work properly without making multiple applications. But there are options that we'll talk about. How much time do I have, by the way? What time do we want to wrap this up? So already 11:30, almost. I could do it in 10 minutes if that works. Yeah. Okay. And I can record a more lengthy version of this later where my voice actually works too. Yes. Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, great question. And that's a good segue to talking about some of these broadleaf products. So the question is, if I've got Japanese stilt grass, which means I need to put out my pre-emergent earlier, then how does that interact with the broadleaf herbicides, because that pre-emergence in the soil for a long period of time? You don't have to, if you put out a pre-emergent, the broadleaf herbicides and the broadleaf weeds are independent of it and not affected by it. So perennials, those pre-emergents aren't going to control perennials like dandelion. So you don't need to, you could do them both on the same day if you wanted to. It doesn't matter. Although I wouldn't be treating for broadleaves in early March necessarily. But to answer your question, they work independently of one another. So you don't have to worry about it. Yeah. The pre-emergents they're designed to kind of hang out in the soil for a while until the microbes chew them up. Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good point. Yeah. So when you make that application a little bit earlier, that pre-emergent probably is going to run out a little bit earlier. And if you've got a severe crabgrass problem, you are maybe a little bit susceptible to breakthrough. And you want to be maybe watching for that, or using and maybe have a post-emergence crabgrass product ready. We've done some work on looking at early pre-emergence applications in February, actually. They do run out sooner, but they don't run out that much sooner because most of the breakdown of those pre-emergence is dependent on soil temperature. So the soil temperatures are cool in the spring. So they don't break down nearly as quickly in the spring as they do as that soil warms. Sort of a general rule of thumb is every 10-degree increase in soil temperature doubles the microbial activity, and so it also doubles the rate of pre-emergence herbicide breakdown. Yes. You can do 2 applications of the pre-emergent. Yeah, you won't see that necessarily recommended with the programs that are sold in the big box stores, but that is a strategy you can use. And we've got that outlined in that fact sheet a little bit, but you can do that. One of the ways we do that in our research to kind of support the professional lawn care industry, because most of the professional lawn care operators are making 2 applications. Make 1 application whenever you want to start that program, and then another one 6 to 8 weeks later. So. Yeah. All right. I would say do that in conditions of severe, crabgrass So if you've got a lawn that hasn't seen crabgrass in 10 years, you probably don't have to apply a pre-emergent at all, right? So, but that's yeah. That's easier to recommend as an experiment in your own lawn than when you're running the health line, right? So you got to be careful. All right, so broadleaf weed control products. These are often, what we're also thinking about in the spring. The fall right now is actually the best time to spray these things, but that's probably not when you're going to get the questions. Your typical, there's a number of these products out there, and basically the bottom line is they contain one of these active ingredients, 2,4-D, or these synthetic auxin type herbicides. You want to just encourage customers or clients to read the label. You also have the step 2 program. So step 1 was the pre-emergence. The step 2s have the fertilizer or the herbicide on the fertilizer. I'm hesitant to recommend these because you're applying a broadleaf weed control product that's you're applying it to the whole lawn, where usually broadleaf weeds aren't usually a problem over the whole lawn. So usually try to recommend, just buying a liquid product and spot treating if you want to get rid of these things. But, they're very effective. 2,4-D is extremely effective on dandelions. A lot of the questions I get are, how do I control some of these tougher to control weeds, things like wood sorrel, ground ivy, clover, violets. So these active ingredients listed here are more effective on that, right? And I'll just kind of move through this relatively quickly. You want to be careful when you want to advise people to be careful with these, right? All dicot plants are sensitive to these products. So if you're applying them around a vegetable garden or a flower bed and you're just indiscriminately spraying them, then they will injure any dicot plant, right? So looking at alternative products, this is not organic, but there is an alternative option out there that's chelated iron. And that is sold under different trade names. We've done some work with it. Basically, it's operating on the principle that broadleaf plants are more sensitive to iron than monocots. So what you get when you spray it, and you can see this is from our research plots, you get really black, kind of burned dicot plants. It's basically a contact herbicide, so you'll need to make multiple applications to control these things like dandelions and clovers, which are perennials and have a lot of regenerative capacity. But it is an option, that you could recommend. So let's move to summer, where we're all interested in going to the beach and maybe not worrying about the lawn, but the lawn is kind of struggling and susceptible to weeds, right? This is my lawn this summer. Looked a little dry. Well, in the summer, we're concerned we talked about the annuals already. So let's talk a little bit about perennials, and particularly warm season perennials that we see in the summertime, right? So post-emergence crabgrass control, either you didn't apply a pre-emergent or it maybe broke through a little bit for some of the reasons we mentioned. The products that are available in the home horticulture market are basically using either quinclorac or phenoxyprop active ingredients. But when you get a plant that's this big, which is probably when they're calling you because it's a big problem, multiple applications will be required, right? These plants are growing rapidly. They're really mature by this point. It's going to be multiple applications on a couple week interval, 2 to 3 weeks, to get control of big plants. So just remind them, set the expectation that this is not going to control it with one shot, and encourage label reading, especially when we've got drought and those sorts of conditions where you don't want to be applying these products. Let's talk about sedges and kalingas. So sedges are, the old saying is, right, sedges have edges. So they're monocots, but they're not grasses. So these products are not going to control sedges, right? So yellow nutsedge is the most problematic one. You can see the stem here. So the cross section of the stem is a triangle. If you look at it from the top, you can see the leaf arrangement is 3 ranked instead of, opposite. So 120-degree angles from each other are those leaves, right? Yellow nutsedge is really problematic. It grows quickly compared to the desirable turf. You probably all know nutsedge, right? I would think the main reason it's problematic is because of these tubers that you see on the right-hand side of the screen that are underground. You don't have to worry about the seed from this weed, and most other perennial weeds, the seed isn't really a huge problem. So the problem with nutsedge is it begins making new tubers for next year just a few weeks after it emerges in the springtime. So when you get the call in August, how do I control nutsedge? Well, we can recommend things to control the nutsedge for that year, but a lot of those tubers are already there and have set themselves for the next year. And the tubers are really interesting. They're even more problematic than seed. Here's a nutsedge tuber, and you can see it's basically a potato, right? But what's interesting about tubers is typically in the spring, one shoot will start to grow out of the tuber. And if you burn it off with an herbicide or pull it out in your garden, what happens is the tuber actually stays in the ground, and all the other buds that you see circled in red actually then start to grow because there's still a lot of carbohydrates left over in that tuber, which if you pulled a seedling out of the ground, right, you would have controlled it. So nutsedge is very difficult to control. Dense turf grass can reduce that tuber production. This is some work from Nebraska. Nutsedge really likes areas of chronically high soil moisture. Here it is growing next to an irrigation head. Now, I know everyone will say, well, this summer I saw nutsedge everywhere and it was dry. Well, yeah, it does well because it's a warm season perennial. So it grows well in hot, dry conditions, but oftentimes when it establishes, it competes very well where it's wet. So those chronically high soil moisture areas. These are two products you can recommend for control. This one is nice because it's a pre-mixed pack that's good to dump into 1 gallon of water. And it can be a little bit more effective and easy to use than the sulfentrazone-based products on the right, but we won't get too much into that today. Another sedge species is false green kalinga that you may all be familiar with, particularly right now when you see, usually the questions start to come in when you see these seed heads, right? Because it looks actually, hopefully you can see in this picture, it looks a lot like turf grass in the summertime. But this is a perennial sedge species also, similar to yellow nutsedge, but it doesn't have the tubers underground. So this one's become a big problem in New Jersey in the last 10 to 15 years, particularly those of you on the coastal counties, Atlantic Ocean, those sorts of things. And it's a warm season perennial, so it goes dormant in the wintertime, and that's also when it sticks out like a sore thumb, right? So with these perennials, whether it's clover, whether it's nutsedge or kalinga, we're after some perennial structure that we need to eliminate. If we don't kill that perennial structure, the weed will just keep coming back. So in the case of kalinga, it's actually this rhizome here, which is an underground stem. So there's different ways we can control kalinga, but we can physically just remove it with a sod cutter or cut it out or dig it out with a shovel, those sorts of things. I want to talk with some of these perennial weeds and close with, how can you, when you've got these perennial weeds, which we didn't cover all of them today, but how can you take advantage of back to Labor Day and the fall to really get them under control and have them complement your herbicide programs? So this is some work we've done with kalinga, where we were doing a lot of work and we were spraying herbicides and we found some that worked better than others. But regardless, it took many herbicide applications to get control. But when we coupled that with the opportunity to introduce a cultural practice that improves turfgrass density, in this case, tall fescue seeding, we got much more control. And so the fall is a really good time to tackle that seeding. And so what we did in this case was, you see the plot on the left, we sprayed it in mid-August with the herbicide for kalinga control. And on the top half of the plot, we seeded, and on the bottom half of the plot, we didn't. And basically, when you come back the next summer and you've got your seeding that's established well, there's almost no kalinga at the top of the screen there on the right. But on the lower right-hand corner of the screen, the weed has almost entirely come back because all we did was spray an herbicide, and we didn't introduce a competitor to that plant, right? So this applies to other perennial grasses too. Anytime you look at perennial weed control, we can recommend herbicides, but unless you're going to do something to introduce competition, particularly where those perennial species have crowded things out, it's going to be difficult to get control. I talked about this earlier in the YouTube video, but these species are becoming more problematic in New Jersey, and they are perennials as opposed to annuals, and they are not crabgrass. All right, so I think that's pretty much it. I did have one thing on organic options. Basically, right now, what's available in terms of organic weed control is all non-selective. So if you spray the grass, it's going to kill the grass just as well as the weed. And they're contact herbicides, so they're not systemically translocating to any of those perennial tissues. So the plant can regenerate, even a mature annual plant can regenerate and recover from these organic options. And I would be careful to not recommend homebrew remedies because they're not labeled pesticides. So from agricultural extension, we want to be recommending things that are labeled, registered for that use. Just closing real quick about, alternative lawns and clovers and that kind of thing. I think it's a really interesting area. Do we need to have a monoculture of turf grass? But there's not really a lot of research out there about how do these micro clover turf lawns that are integrated fare in the long term. There's a lot of people selling them, and I don't think it's necessarily a problem, but you just want to be careful recommending them because there's not been a lot of research on it, and some of the benefits I think are a little bit overstated. So yes. How late in the fall can you see? Good question. Now is getting to be a little bit too late, especially for tall fescue. The ideal time is Labor Day to maybe early to mid-October. But we've got some fact sheets on that will help. That I probably shouldn't even be making those recommendations, but it's on the fact sheets. Yes, question. Okay, the question is, when do I thatch, or I guess when do you want to remove that thatch? Yeah, right. Yeah, so if your primary weed issue is crabgrass, right, you wouldn't want to dethatch in the springtime because you're just going to open up a whole bunch of a canopy. And you also want to just make sure you're only dethatching if you've got a lot of thatch. But in this case, you said when. So yeah, late summer would be ideal really for all that sort of stuff. Yeah, good question. I know we're running out of time, Nick. Mm-hmm. Okay, the question is are the pesticides included? Yes, they are. We do have some outdated fact sheets that I think need to be removed that maybe recommend some outdated chemistries, but the pesticides haven't really changed much, in the last 20 years. 2,4-D was invented in 1944, right? And still around. So, but they are in the fact sheets, and typically the fact sheets will refer to active ingredients. The reason we don't talk about products is the products names change quite frequently. So you'll just want to, always look at the active ingredients on that label, right? Question. Core aerating, yes. I guess when to core aerate, do you need to? Core aerating is usually a good way to relieve compaction and reduce thatch. In a typical home lawn, if you don't have, either one of those problems, you don't necessarily need to aerate all the time, but it's never a bad idea. I'm not the expert on that practice. It's more of a question for our turf management specialist, but it's probably covered in some of the fact sheets. But the best time to do it would be fall. I think the question you want to ask is, do I really need to do it? Do I have, issues with water infiltration or whatever? Most lawns, unless they're highly trafficked, kind of aerate themselves as the roots grow and die and that sort of thing. And there's insect activity, that sort of thing. It's a good, if you're doing aeration, a good time to do it would be when you seed, because it's an opportunity for the seed to catch in those holes. So if you're seeding, it's a good practice. But yeah, it's a good question. Any other questions at risk of making this program even later? No, I appreciate your time. I guess my voice is a little bit better by the end of this, maybe. So, and appreciate you putting up with my voice. So thanks.